Stay with me, don't close your eyes, okay? The words came out breathless, trembling, barely louder than the rain that hammered against the pavement, but they cut through the night like a lifeline thrown into darkness. The car lay twisted off the shoulder of Route 9, half hidden in a ditch where the guardrail had given way, its headlights flickering weakly like they were trying to remember how to shine. Steam curled up from beneath the crumpled hood, mixing with the cold mist that rolled across the asphalt, and for a long moment, the world felt suspended between motion and stillness, like time itself had hesitated. Amina Brooks had already walked past it once. She had seen the wreck from the corner of her eye as she hurried along the narrow strip of gravel, her hoodie pulled tight against the November wind, her worn sneakers soaked through from puddles that reflected the dull glow of passing headlights. Cars had slowed, just for a second, drivers leaning forward behind their wheels, curious, calculating, and then each one had kept going, red taillights disappearing into the distance like a string of quiet refusals. She had done the same. At first. Because stopping meant getting involved, and getting involved meant questions, and questions had a way of turning into things people like her couldn't afford. But then she heard it. Not a scream. Not even a call for help. Just a sound, low, uneven, human. A breath that didn't belong to the wind. Her steps faltered. The gravel shifted under her feet as she slowed, her chest tightening in a way she couldn't explain. She glanced back over her shoulder, eyes narrowing through the rain, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just the hiss of cooling metal or the echo of tires on wet pavement. But it came again. Softer this time. Fragile. Like someone holding on to the last thread of something slipping away. Amina stopped completely. For a second, she just stood there, caught between two choices that felt heavier than they should have. Keep walking, stay invisible, stay safe. Or turn around, step into something unknown, something complicated, something that might not end well. The wind pushed against her, carrying the faint smell of gasoline and wet earth, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, too far away to matter right now. She closed her eyes for half a heartbeat. Then let out a slow breath that fogged in the cold air. You don't leave someone like that, she whispered to herself, as if saying it out loud would make it easier. Then she turned back. Each step toward the wreck felt louder than it should have, her shoes crunching against gravel, her pulse syncing with the faint, irregular sound coming from inside the car. Up close, it looked worse. The front end was crushed inward, the windshield fractured into a web of tiny cracks that caught the light like shattered glass in a museum display. The driver's side door was jammed, bent just enough to resist when she reached for the handle. For a moment, her hand hovered there, fingers trembling, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what she was about to do. Then she pulled. It didn't budge. She set her jaw, shifted her footing, and tried again, this time with everything she had, the metal groaning in protest before finally giving just enough to open a narrow gap. Cold air rushed inside, carrying the sound with it more clearly now. Breathing. Uneven. Alive. Hey, she said quickly, leaning in, her voice softer now but steadier, like she was trying to anchor both of them at once. Hey, can you hear me? Inside, slumped against the seat, was a man who didn't belong in a place like this. Even in the dim, flickering light, there was something unmistakable about him, the tailored coat, the watch catching a faint glint, the kind of presence that spoke of boardrooms and glass towers, not roadside ditches and broken guardrails. His head tilted slightly as if he'd heard her, his eyes barely opening, unfocused, searching. For a split second, their worlds met in that narrow space between the door and the storm. Amina swallowed hard, shifting closer, one hand bracing against the cold frame of the car as the other hovered near his shoulder, careful, unsure, but determined. Stay with me, she repeated, her voice firmer now, stronger than she felt. Help's coming. You're not alone. The words hung there, fragile but real, carried by the rain, by the wind, by something deeper than fear. And for the first time that night, the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it was waiting. The rain did not let up, it came down harder now, drumming against the metal frame. And pooling along the edge of the ditch as if the night itself was trying to swallow everything whole, and Amina could feel the cold seeping through her sleeves, through her skin, but she did not move away, not even an inch, because the man in front of her was still breathing and that was enough to keep her there, her hand hovering just above his shoulder before finally settling there gently, careful, steady, like she was afraid that any sudden motion might make him disappear. "Hey, stay with me," she said again, her voice low but urgent, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he was still there, really there. His eyelids fluttered, barely, his gaze unfocused, drifting somewhere between awareness and nothingness, and for a second she thought he might slip away again, but then his lips parted slightly, a faint breath escaping, uneven but real, and that was enough, that was everything. "Good, that is good," she whispered quickly, nodding to herself as much as to him, like she was trying to hold the moment together by sheer will. She shifted her weight, glancing back over her shoulder at the empty stretch of road where headlights occasionally passed but never slowed, each car a blur of light and distance, none of them stopping, none of them seeing what she saw, or maybe they saw it and chose not to know. Her jaw tightened for a brief second, but she pushed the thought away. There was no time for that, not now. Her focus snapped back to him, to the faint rise and fall of his chest, to the way his fingers twitched slightly against the seat as if he was trying to hold on to something invisible. "Can you hear me?" she asked, leaning in closer, her voice softer now but sharper at the edges. "If you can hear me, just stay right there, do not go anywhere, okay?" It sounded strange even to her ears, telling someone not to go anywhere when they could barely move, but the words mattered, the presence mattered. She had learned that much from watching life unfold in small, quiet ways. Sometimes people just needed a voice to follow, even if they could not answer it. Her eyes flicked down to her pocket, to the cracked screen of her phone. She pulled it out quickly, her fingers stiff from the cold as she tapped the screen, trying to get a signal. One bar flickered, then disappeared, then came back again like it was unsure if it wanted to help or not. Come on, she muttered under her breath, pacing a small step to the side, lifting the phone higher as if that might catch something in the air. Finally the call connected, faint, unstable, but there. 911, what is your emergency? The voice on the other end was calm, distant, professional, and for a second Amina did not answer, not because she did not know what to say, but because the reality of it all hit her at once. The rain, the wreck, the man, the fact that she was the only one here. "There is a crash," she said quickly, her voice tightening. "Route 9, near the old exit sign, the car went off the road. He is still breathing but he needs help. Please hurry." She could hear typing on the other end, questions forming, details being asked, but her attention kept pulling back to him, to the sound of his breathing, to the way his head shifted slightly as if he was trying to focus on her voice. "Stay with me," she said again, louder this time, not to the phone, but to him, her free hand now steady against his shoulder, grounding him, grounding herself. "You are doing good, just keep breathing, okay?" The dispatcher's voice continued, asking her to stay on the line, asking her to describe his condition, and she did, as best as she could. Her words simple, direct, focused on what mattered, because anything more felt like too much, felt like it would break the fragile balance holding everything together. "Help is on the way," the voice assured her, and those words settled into her chest like something solid, something she could hold on to. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air as she leaned closer again, her eyes locking onto his. "You hear that?" she said, softer now, almost a whisper meant only for him. "They are coming. You just have to stay with me a little longer." His gaze shifted again, just enough to meet hers for a brief second, and in that moment, something passed between them, something unspoken but unmistakable, not recognition, not yet, but awareness, the kind that forms when two lives collide in a way neither of them expected, the kind that does not ask for permission. The wind howled louder, the rain pressed down harder, but inside that narrow space between the broken car and the girl who refused to leave, there was a different kind of silence now, not empty, not waiting, but holding, as if the night itself had paused to see what she would do next. And Amina did not look away, she did not step back. She stayed exactly where she was, her voice steady, her presence unwavering, repeating the same words over and over like a promise she refused to break. "You are not alone, not tonight, not anymore." The first distant wail of sirens did not arrive all at once, it slipped into the night slowly, almost uncertain, carried by the wind like something fragile that could disappear if no one listened closely enough, and for a moment Amina was not sure if she imagined it or if it was real, her head tilting slightly as her eyes flicked toward the dark stretch of road beyond the ditch. "Do you hear that?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she leaned closer to the man, her hand still steady on his shoulder, grounding him, grounding herself. "That is for you, they are coming." The words felt different now, no longer just something to hold on to, but something approaching, something real, and she could feel it shift the air around them. Even the rain seemed to change its rhythm, like the night itself was beginning to move again. His breathing hitched slightly, uneven but present, and his eyes, still heavy, still unfocused, tried once more to settle on her face, and this time they stayed a fraction longer, enough for her to see something there, not clarity, not yet, but awareness, a flicker of recognition that someone was there with him, that he was not alone in that broken silence. "That is it," she said quickly, her voice gaining strength. "Just stay right there, keep looking at me." She shifted her position slightly, bracing one knee against the edge of the car as the cold metal pressed through her jeans, her free hand adjusting the collar of his coat just enough to keep him steady, careful, always careful, like every small movement mattered, because it did, everything did. The sound of the sirens grew louder now, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, cutting through the rain with a sharp, rising urgency that filled the empty space around them, and for the first time since she had turned back, Amina felt something loosen in her chest, not relief exactly, but the beginning of it, the possibility of it. She glanced down at him again, studying his face more closely now, the lines, the stillness, the quiet strength even in this moment, and something about it did not match the place they were in, like he belonged somewhere else entirely, somewhere with glass walls and polished floors, not here in the cold mud beside a broken guardrail. "You picked a bad night for a drive," she murmured, a faint, almost tired smile touching her lips as she spoke, not expecting an answer, not needing one, just filling the space with something human, something normal, because silence felt too heavy otherwise. His fingers shifted again, a slight movement, but enough to catch her attention immediately. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping again, softer, more focused. "That is good, keep doing that, you are still here." The sirens were close now, so close that the flashing lights began to reflect off the wet road, red and blue streaks cutting through the darkness like signals breaking through a storm. Amina turned her head briefly, shielding her eyes from the glare as the first emergency vehicle slowed near the shoulder, tires hissing against the wet pavement, and then suddenly everything that had been still burst into motion, doors opening, voices calling out, footsteps rushing across gravel. But even as the world rushed in, Amina did not move away, not yet. She stayed exactly where she was, her focus still locked on him, her voice steady, unwavering. "You are going to be okay," she said again, quieter now, almost like a promise meant only for him. Even though she knew she could not guarantee it, even though she did not know what would happen next, but the words mattered, the belief mattered. A paramedic's voice reached her then, calm but firm, asking her to step back, to give them space, and for a brief second she hesitated, her hand still resting on his shoulder as if letting go would break something unseen, but then she nodded, slowly, carefully pulling her hand away, the absence of contact immediate and strange, like stepping out of something she had been holding together. She rose to her feet, her legs stiff from the cold, from the tension she had not realized she was carrying, and took a step back, watching as they moved in, checking him, speaking in quick, measured tones that blended into the sound of the rain and the fading echo of sirens. One of them glanced at her, offering a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement that said more than words could, and she returned it without thinking, her arms wrapping around herself now as the cold finally caught up to her, her hoodie clinging to her shoulders, heavy with rain. She stood there for a moment longer, watching as they carefully lifted him, as they worked with practiced precision, as the scene that had once felt frozen now moved forward without her, and in that shift, something changed, not in the world, but in her place within it. She had been the only one there, the only voice, the only presence, and now she was not needed in the same way. The space she had filled closing quietly behind her. She took another step back, then another, her eyes lingering on him just long enough to see his face one more time, to make sure he was still there, still breathing, still real, and then she turned, not quickly, not dramatically, just a simple movement away from the flashing lights and the gathered figures, her footsteps soft against the gravel as she walked back toward the road, toward the same darkness she had come from, but something was different now, something she could not quite name, and as the sirens faded into the background and the rain continued to fall, the night did not feel as empty as it had before, because somewhere behind her, a life was still moving forward, and for reasons she did not fully understand, she had become a part of that story, even if only for a moment. The flashing lights faded behind her with every step she took, their red and blue reflections dissolving into the wet pavement until they became nothing more than distant pulses swallowed by the rain, and Amina kept walking, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the cold finally settled deep into her bones, her sneakers squelching softly with each step as water seeped through the worn soles, but she did not stop, not because she was in a hurry, but because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean replaying everything that had just happened, and she was not sure she was ready for that yet. The road stretched ahead of her, empty again, as if nothing had ever happened there at all, as if the crash, the man, the voices, the urgency had all been folded back into the night and erased, and yet she could still hear it, faintly, in her head, his uneven breathing, the quiet way his eyes had tried to find hers, the weight of his presence even in silence. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, and for a moment she slowed her pace, her steps becoming quieter, more measured, like she was trying to match the rhythm of something she could not quite name. "You are not alone," she whispered under her breath, repeating the words she had said to him, but now they sounded different, softer, almost like they were meant for herself. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant hum of the ambulance engine pulling away, heading toward somewhere bright and controlled and far removed from this quiet stretch of road, and she pictured it without trying, the clean lights, the voices, the movement, people who knew what to do, people who would take over where she had left off, and that thought should have made her feel lighter, but instead it left a strange emptiness in its place, like stepping out of a room where something important had just happened and realizing no one else would ever see it the same way she had. She reached the edge of the road and paused, just for a second, her gaze drifting back over her shoulder toward the darkness she had just left behind, but the scene was gone now, swallowed completely, replaced by nothing more than rain and silence, and she let out a small breath, turning forward again, continuing on, her path leading toward the faint glow of streetlights in the distance, toward the part of the city that did not ask questions, that did not notice who came and went. Her phone buzzed faintly in her hand, the screen flickering weakly before going dark again, and she slipped it back into her pocket without checking it, because whatever it was, it could wait, everything could wait. The night stretched on, long and quiet, and eventually the sound of traffic grew louder again, steady and indifferent, as if the world had already moved on, and in a way, it had, but not for him, not for the man she had left behind, miles away now, inside a place filled with light and urgency, where machines hummed softly and voices spoke in calm, measured tones, where Richard Hale lay still against crisp white sheets, the chaos of the road replaced by something quieter, something more controlled, his breathing steadier now, guided by the rhythm of machines and careful hands, but his mind drifted somewhere else entirely, caught in a space that was neither fully awake nor fully gone, a place where fragments of memory floated without order, without explanation, flashes of light, the sound of rain, the weight of something pressing down, and then a voice, soft but insistent, cutting through everything else. "Stay with me," it echoed again and again, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore. His brow shifted slightly, a faint crease forming as if he was trying to hold on to it, to follow it back to where it came from. The image was unclear, just a shape at first, a presence leaning close, steady, unwavering, and then slowly, piece by piece, it sharpened, not into a full face, not yet, but into something he could feel more than see, warmth in the cold, calm in the chaos, a certainty that had no reason to exist and yet had been there anyway. His fingers twitched slightly against the sheets, the movement small but deliberate, as if reaching for something just out of grasp, and somewhere in the quiet hum of the room, that voice lingered, not fading, not disappearing, but staying, anchored in a moment that refused to be forgotten. And even as the machines continued their steady rhythm and the world outside moved forward without pause, something inside him had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, because in a night Filled with noise and absence, there had been one voice that chose not to leave, and now, in the silence that followed, it was the only thing he could still hear. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and quiet, the kind of quiet that did not come from silence but from control, from everything being exactly where it needed to be, machines humming softly, lights steady and bright, and Richard Hale lay there beneath it all, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that no longer belonged entirely to him, his body still, but his mind not, never still, because that voice had not left, it lingered just beneath the surface of his thoughts, threading through the haze like something unfinished, something unresolved. "Stay with me," it echoed again, softer now, but clearer, and his eyes opened slowly, not all at once, but in stages, like someone stepping back into a room they were not sure they recognized. The ceiling above him came into focus first, white, clean, unfamiliar, and then the edges of the room, shapes and shadows settling into place, until finally the awareness hit him fully, sharp and undeniable. He was not on the road anymore, he was somewhere else, somewhere safe, and yet the first thing he felt was not relief, it was absence. His gaze shifted slightly, searching without knowing exactly what he was looking for, his lips parted, dry, his voice barely forming at first. "Where?" The word broke off, his throat tightening as he tried again. "Where is she?" The question hung in the air, fragile but urgent, and for a moment there was no answer, just the soft beeping of the monitor beside him and the distant murmur of voices outside the room. A nurse stepped closer then, her expression calm, practiced, but gentle. "You are in the hospital, sir," she said, her tone steady, reassuring. "You were in an accident, but you are stable now." He blinked slowly, processing the words, but they did not land the way they should have, they did not settle into him, because they were not what he was asking. His gaze shifted again, more focused this time, more insistent. "The girl," he said, his voice still weak but clearer now, "the one who stayed, where is she?" The nurse hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, not because she did not want to answer, but because she did not have one. "I am not sure," she replied carefully. "The paramedics said someone was there when they arrived, but she was gone before they could get her name." Something in his expression changed then, subtle but unmistakable, a tightening, a quiet shift that spoke of something deeper than confusion, something closer to disbelief. Like the idea that she could simply disappear did not fit with what he remembered, with what he felt. His hand moved slightly against the sheets, fingers curling as if reaching for something that was no longer there. "She was there," he said, more to himself than to anyone else, his voice low, certain. "She did not leave, but she had," and the realization settled in slowly, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a truth that refused to be ignored. He closed his eyes briefly, and the image came back again, not perfect, not complete, but enough, the outline of her, the steadiness in her voice, the way she had spoken to him like he mattered, like he was not just another moment to pass by. And it did not make sense, not in the world he knew, because in his world, people did not stay without a reason, they did not step into chaos without something to gain, but she had, and that was the part he could not let go of. His eyes opened again, sharper now, more present, and there was something different in them, something that had not been there before, not just awareness, but intent. "Find her," he said quietly, the words directed at no one in particular, but carrying weight nonetheless. The nurse glanced at him, slightly taken aback by the sudden clarity in his tone, but he did not elaborate, did not explain, because he could not fully, not yet. He just knew that the absence she left behind was too loud to ignore, too real to dismiss. Outside the room, the world continued as it always did, footsteps moving down hallways, voices exchanging information, lives intersecting and passing without pause, but inside that room, something had shifted. Something small but irreversible, because for the first time in a long time, Richard Hale was not thinking about numbers, or deals, or outcomes. He was thinking about a moment, a single moment in the rain, where someone had chosen not to leave. And now, in the quiet aftermath of survival, that choice had become the only thing that mattered. The request did not echo loudly through the room, it did not trigger alarms or sudden movement, but it settled into the air with a quiet weight that was impossible to ignore, and within minutes, it began to ripple outward, moving beyond the hospital walls into a world that responded differently to words like his, because when Richard Hale spoke, people listened, not because of who he was in that moment, lying still beneath soft lights and steady machines, but because of everything he represented outside of it, the reach, the influence, the power that extended far beyond a single room, and somewhere across the city, in offices lined with glass and steel, phones began to ring, screens lit up, voices shifted from routine to urgency. "We need everything from the scene," one voice said, sharp and focused, "traffic cameras, nearby businesses, anything that shows who was there before the responders arrived." Another responded just as quickly, "We will pull everything we can," and the search began, not loud, not chaotic, but precise, methodical, driven by a single question that refused to be dismissed: who was she? Back at the hospital, Richard lay still, but there was nothing passive about him now, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as if he could see beyond it, past the walls, past the distance, into the space where that moment had lived. His fingers moved slightly against the sheets, not restless, not uncertain, but deliberate, like someone holding onto a thread they refused to let slip away. The nurse returned briefly, checking monitors, adjusting small details that kept everything steady, and she paused for a moment, watching him, noticing the difference, the clarity in his eyes, the focus that had not been there before. "You should rest," she said gently, her tone calm. "Your body needs time." But he did not respond right away, not because he had not heard her, but because the idea of rest felt distant, irrelevant. "I will," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. After, he did not finish the sentence, did not need to, because the meaning was already there, complete in its silence. Across town, Amina stepped into the narrow hallway of the building she called home, the flickering overhead light casting uneven shadows along the walls as she pushed the door closed behind her, the sound of the rain fading slightly now, replaced by the quiet hum of pipes and distant footsteps from other apartments. Her hoodie clung to her shoulders, heavy and damp, and she pulled it off slowly, draping it over the back of a chair as she moved further inside. The room was small, simple, familiar, everything in its place, unchanged, and for a moment she just stood there, her arms hanging loosely at her sides, as if she had not fully arrived yet, as if part of her was still out there on the road, still hearing that voice, still feeling the weight of that moment. She exhaled slowly, running a hand through her damp hair, her gaze drifting toward the small window where droplets of rain traced slow paths down the glass. And without thinking, she leaned against the wall beside it, her eyes closing briefly. "You are going to be okay," she whispered again, the words softer now, almost like a question she could not answer. She shook her head lightly, pushing herself away from the wall, moving toward the sink to rinse her hands, the cold water grounding her, bringing her back into the present, back into something she understood, something she could control. But even as she did, the memory did not fade. It stayed, steady and quiet, just beneath the surface. Back in the hospital, a man in a dark suit stepped into the room, his presence subtle but purposeful, pausing just inside the doorway before approaching the bed. "We have started pulling footage," he said, his voice low, respectful, but efficient. "There are a few cameras along that stretch of road. We should have something within the hour." Richard turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting the man's with a focus that needed no explanation. "She was there before anyone else," he said, his voice steady. "She stayed." The man nodded once, understanding more from what was not said than from what was. "We will find her," he replied, without hesitation, because that was what was expected, what was required. But as he turned to leave, there was a brief pause, a moment where even he seemed to recognize that this was not just another task, not just another search, this was something else. Something that did not fit neatly into reports or results, something that carried a different kind of weight. And back in that quiet room, as the machines continued their steady rhythm and the night slowly gave way to the first hints of morning, Richard closed his eyes again, not to rest, not completely, but to hold on to that voice, that presence, that single moment where everything had shifted, because somewhere out there, in a city that moved too fast to notice most things, there was someone who had chosen not to walk away, and now, no matter how long it took, he would not either. Morning did not arrive all at once, it crept in quietly, a pale gray light pressing gently against the windows of the hospital, softening the sharp edges of the night, and inside the room, nothing moved except the steady rise and fall of Richard's chest and the faint blinking of monitors that marked time in a language more precise than seconds. His eyes opened again, not with urgency this time, but with intention. As if he had carried something through the night and now refused to set it down. The memory was still there, not faded, not distorted, but clearer now, shaped by the quiet hours in between, the rain, the cold, the voice. It all returned in fragments that fit together more firmly than before, and with it came a certainty that settled deep in his chest. She had been real, and she had chosen to stay. The door opened softly, and the man in the dark suit stepped back inside, a tablet in his hand. His expression focused but measured. "We found something," he said, his voice low, but carrying a quiet urgency that matched the weight of the moment. Richard turned his head slightly, his eyes locking onto him immediately. No hesitation, no delay. "Show me," he said, the words simple but firm. The man stepped closer, angling the screen so it was visible, and for a second, nothing happened, just a paused frame, grainy, distant, the kind of image that could easily be overlooked if no one was searching for it. But then the video began to play, headlights cutting through the rain, a car slowing just enough to capture a glimpse of the scene, the wreck barely visible off the shoulder, and then, there, a figure, small against the darkness, standing near the open door, unmoving, steady. The footage was not clear enough to show details, not enough to see her face, but it was enough to confirm what he already knew. She had been there. She had not imagined it, she had not disappeared into something unreal. She existed, and that was all that mattered. Richard leaned slightly forward, his gaze fixed on the screen, studying every movement, every shadow. As if he could pull more from it than what was visible. "That is her," he said quietly, not a question, not a guess, but a statement that left no room for doubt. The man nodded once, already anticipating the next step. "We are pulling additional footage from nearby intersections," he replied. "We will track her path as far as we can." Richard did not respond immediately, his eyes still on the screen as the video looped again. The figure standing in the rain, unwavering, and something about that stillness stayed with him, something about the way she had not moved, had not turned away like the others. It did not match anything he understood about the world he came from, and that difference made it impossible to ignore. Across the city, Amina sat on the edge of her bed, her hands wrapped loosely around a chipped ceramic mug, the warmth of it pressing into her palms, grounding her in a way that the night had not allowed. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that came after something had shifted. Even if nothing around her had physically changed, she stared at the steam rising slowly from the mug, her thoughts drifting without direction, until they settled, inevitably, back on that moment, the sound of his voice, the weight of his presence, the way he had looked at her, not fully aware, not fully present, but still there, still reaching. She exhaled slowly, taking a small sip, the warmth spreading through her chest. But it did not erase the memory, it only made it clearer, more defined. "You are not alone," she whispered again, the words automatic now, familiar, and yet this time, they felt different, heavier somehow, like they carried something beyond that single moment. Her phone lay on the table beside her, silent, unmoving, but she found herself glancing at it anyway, not expecting anything, not waiting for anything, just aware of it in a way she had not been before. Back in the hospital, the video ended, and the room returned to its quiet state, but the stillness no longer felt empty, it felt focused, directed. "Find her," Richard said again, this time more clearly, more firmly, and there was something in his tone that shifted the air, something that made it clear this was not a passing request, not something that would fade with time. The man in the suit straightened slightly, nodding once. "We will," he said, and this time, it sounded less like a response and more like a promise, because somewhere between the rain and the silence, a connection had formed that neither of them fully understood, but both of them could feel. And now, in the light of a new day, that connection was no longer just a memory, it was a direction, one that would not be ignored, one that would not be left behind. The city moved forward without hesitation, traffic building, conversations overlapping, lives unfolding in quiet routines that did not pause for anything, and yet beneath that constant motion, something else was happening, something quieter, more deliberate, threads being pulled together one by one, footage analyzed, timestamps aligned, routes traced not by chance but by intention. And in a dim office filled with the glow of multiple screens, a pattern began to form, not complete, not perfect, but enough to follow. She walked north after the responders arrived, one voice said, pointing to a sequence of frames stitched together from different cameras. "Lost visibility here, but picked up again 2 blocks later, another added, their tone focused, precise, the kind of work that turned fragments into direction. Back in the hospital, Richard sat slightly more upright now. The stiffness in his posture a quiet testament to his refusal to remain passive. The tablet rested in his hands as he watched another clip, this one clearer than the last, showing a narrow stretch of sidewalk under a flickering streetlight, and then, there, the same figure, walking away from the road, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold, steady, unhurried, as if the moment behind her did not belong to her anymore, as if she had already let it go. Richard leaned closer, his eyes narrowing slightly, not out of suspicion, but concentration, as if every step she took in that footage carried meaning he needed to understand. Zoom in, he said quietly, and the image adjusted, still grainy, still imperfect, but closer now, enough to see the outline of her hoodie, the worn edges, the way it clung to her frame, and something about that detail settled into him, something that did not match the world he knew, not the tailored suits, not the polished surfaces, but something simpler, something real, and it stayed with him longer than the image itself. Across town, Amina stepped out onto the sidewalk, the morning air crisp but calmer than the night before, the rain gone, leaving behind only damp pavement and the faint scent of it lingering in the air. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders as she walked, her pace steady, familiar, blending into the rhythm of the city that did not ask where she had been or what she had done. People passed by without looking, without noticing, each one moving within their own world. And for the most part, she preferred it that way, the anonymity, the quiet. But today, something felt slightly off, not wrong, not alarming, just different, like a shift she could not fully explain. She reached the corner and paused, waiting for the light to change, her gaze drifting across the street where storefront windows reflected the movement around her, and for a brief second, she caught her own reflection, her expression neutral, composed, but her eyes holding something deeper. Something that had not been there before. She looked away quickly, shaking it off as the light changed, stepping forward with the flow of people. Back in the office, another clip appeared, this one capturing a side street, quieter, less traffic, and again, the same figure, moving with purpose but without urgency. We can map her route from here, someone said, their voice steady, already anticipating the next steps. If we cross-reference with residential areas, we can narrow it down. The process continued, methodical, efficient, driven not by chance but by a clear objective. And in the hospital room, Richard watched it all unfold, not with impatience, but with a focused stillness that spoke louder than urgency, because for him, this was not about speed, it was about certainty, about finding the one person who had stood still when everyone else had moved on. He set the tablet aside slowly, his gaze shifting toward the window where daylight now filled the room completely, bright, clear, undeniable, and yet his mind remained anchored in that single moment from the night before, the rain, the voice, the presence that had refused to leave. She walked away, he said quietly, not as an observation, but as something he was still trying to understand. She did what she needed to do, and then she left. The man in the suit nodded slightly, standing near the doorway. Some people do not stay for recognition, he replied, his tone neutral, but thoughtful. Richard's gaze remained on the window, the reflection of the city stretching out beyond it. No, he said after a moment, his voice softer now, but certain, they stay because they choose to, and that difference, that choice, was what made it impossible to forget, impossible to ignore. Across the city, Amina continued walking, unaware of the screens, the footage, the quiet search unfolding behind her, her world moving forward as it always had, step by step, moment by moment. And yet, somewhere beyond her awareness, a path was being traced, a connection being followed, not by coincidence, but by intention. And as the distance between them slowly closed, neither of them knew exactly what would happen when it did, only that the moment that had brought them together once had not ended, it had only begun to unfold. By midday, the search had moved beyond fragments and guesses and into something more precise, more deliberate, the scattered pieces of footage now forming a continuous path that stretched across several blocks. And in the quiet hum of the office, a new frame appeared on the largest screen, clearer than anything before, captured by a small grocery store camera positioned just above the entrance, the angle slightly tilted, the resolution sharper, and there she was again, stepping into view. Beneath the faded awning, her hood lowered now, her face partially visible as she paused for a moment near the door, not looking at the camera, not aware of it, just standing there as if deciding something, and for the first time, the image held more than a silhouette, it held detail, enough to see the curve of her expression, the calm in it, the absence of urgency, as if the night before had not followed her into this moment. "We have a location," someone said, their voice steady but carrying a note of finality that shifted the room, because this was no longer just a direction, it was a place. Back in the hospital, Richard watched the screen as the still image was sent to his tablet, his eyes fixed on it in a way that made everything else in the room fade into the background, and for a long moment, he did not speak, not because he did not have words, but because the image itself demanded silence. It was her, not just in outline, not just in memory, but there, real, present, existing beyond that single moment in the rain. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tablet, a subtle shift, but enough to reveal the weight of it. "That is her," he said quietly, his voice steady, certain, and this time, there was no need for confirmation, no need for interpretation. Because the truth of it was clear, the man in the suit nodded once, already moving forward. "The store is 3 miles from the crash site," he explained. "We are pulling additional footage from the surrounding area, but we can send someone there now." Richard's gaze did not leave the screen, not yet, as if he was committing every detail to memory, every line, every shadow. "No," he said after a moment, his voice calm but firm, "I will go." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forceful, but absolute. The man hesitated briefly, not out of disagreement, but consideration. "You should rest," he said carefully, echoing the same concern that had been voiced before, but Richard shook his head slightly, his eyes finally lifting from the screen, meeting the man's with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "I have rested," he replied, and in that moment, it was clear that rest had nothing to do with it. Across the city, Amina stepped out of the small grocery store, a paper bag folded neatly in her hands, the faint warmth of it pressing against her palms. The bell above the door chiming softly behind her as she moved onto the sidewalk, the sun now high enough to cast long, clean shadows across the pavement, the world bright, ordinary, unchanged. She adjusted her grip on the bag, her movement simple, routine, and for the most part, her thoughts were the same, moving through the familiar patterns of the day, what needed to be done, where she needed to go. The quiet rhythm of a life that did not pause for reflection, and yet, beneath that rhythm, something lingered, something subtle but persistent, like an echo that refused to fully fade. She crossed the street, her gaze forward, unaware of the image captured just moments before, unaware of the path now being traced back to her. Back in the hospital, the room shifted into motion. Once again, arrangements made, details aligned, the quiet efficiency of a world that responded quickly when needed, and within a short span of time, the stillness that had defined the morning was replaced by movement, by preparation, by a direction that had been chosen and would not be altered. Richard stood for the first time since he had arrived, the motion careful, controlled, but determined, the weight of it settling into his posture as he adjusted to it, not fully steady, but steady enough. The nurse stepped forward instinctively, concern in her expression, but he offered a small nod, a reassurance without words, because this was not something that could be delayed, not something that could wait. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware of the quiet convergence taking place within it, two paths moving toward each other, one guided by intention, the other by routine, and somewhere between them, a moment that had begun in the rain was about to find its way into the light. The car did not move fast, it did not need to, it cut through the city with a quiet authority that parted traffic without drawing attention, its tinted windows reflecting the bright afternoon sun as it passed through intersections and along streets that grew narrower, less polished, less predictable, and inside, Richard sat in the back seat, his posture steady but still carrying the weight of recovery, his gaze fixed ahead, not on any one thing, but on the direction itself, the idea of it, the fact that with every block, he was getting closer to something that had already changed him in ways he could not yet explain. The man in the front seat glanced back briefly, his tone measured. "We are 2 minutes out," he said, and Richard gave a small nod, his fingers resting lightly against his knee, not restless, but ready, as if he understood that whatever happened next would not fit into the patterns he was used to. Outside, the streets shifted again, storefronts smaller, signs more worn People moving in quieter rhythms that did not match the pace of the business districts he knew so well, and when the car slowed, then stopped, it did so without announcement, without spectacle, just a simple pause at the edge of the sidewalk. "This is the location," the driver said, and for a second, Richard did not move. Not because he hesitated, but because he was taking it in, the place, the atmosphere, the difference between where he came from and where he was now, and then he opened the door and stepped out, the air warmer than the hospital, carrying the faint scent of the city in motion. He stood there for a moment, adjusting to the ground beneath his feet, to the reality of standing here, not as an observer, not as a figure behind glass, but as someone stepping directly into a moment he had been chasing. Since the night before, across the street, Amina walked at her usual pace, the paper bag still in her hands, her path leading her toward the corner where she would turn, continue, and move on with the rest of her day, her mind already shifting toward the next task, the next place, until something pulled at the edge of her awareness, not a sound, not a voice, but a presence, a subtle shift in the rhythm around her. She slowed slightly, her steps less certain for a brief second, her eyes lifting. Instinctively, and that was when she saw him, standing there on the sidewalk, not far, not hidden, just present, looking directly at her with a focus that made everything else fade. For a moment, neither of them moved, the distance between them filled with something unspoken but unmistakable, recognition, not from memory alone, but from something deeper, something formed in a moment where words had not been needed. Amina's grip on the bag tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the realization settling in, her mind replaying the fragments of the night before, the voice, the breathing, the presence she had refused to leave, and now here he was, no longer a shadow in the rain, no longer a voice in the dark, but real, standing in front of her, alive, steady, looking at her as if he had been searching for this exact moment. Richard took a step forward, not fast, not abrupt, just enough to close part of the distance, his movements careful, deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. "It was you," he said, his voice calm, but carrying something beneath it, something that made the words more than a statement, more than a simple acknowledgement. Amina blinked once, the moment stretching just enough for her to decide whether to respond. Whether to step into this or let it pass like everything else. "You are okay," she said instead, her voice even, grounded, not answering his words directly, but addressing what mattered most to her, what had mattered from the beginning. Richard exhaled softly, a faint shift in his expression, something close to relief, but not quite, because relief was not the point, not anymore, "because you stayed," he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just a simple truth spoken without embellishment. The noise of the street continued around them, people passing, cars moving, life unfolding in the background, but in that small space between them, everything felt still, focused, like the moment had carved out its own place in time. Amina glanced down briefly, then back up, her expression unchanged, steady, as if she had not expected anything from what she had done. As if this was not something that needed to be acknowledged. "Someone had to," she said quietly, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than anything else could have, because it was not about him, not about who he was or what he had, it was about the moment itself, the choice, the decision to not walk away. Richard studied her for a second longer, not analyzing, not questioning, just seeing, understanding in a way that did not require explanation, and in that understanding, something shifted again, not in the world around them, but in the space between them, because this was no longer about finding her, it was about what came after, about what it meant that she had been there when no one else was. And as the afternoon light settled across the street and the city moved forward without pause, the moment that had begun in the rain stood fully in the open, no longer hidden, no longer distant, but real, present, and impossible to ignore. The space between them did not close immediately, it held for a moment, suspended in something quieter than tension and deeper than curiosity, as if both of them understood that what had brought them here could not be rushed, could not be reduced to a simple exchange of words, and the city moved around them, footsteps passing, distant conversations blending into a steady hum, but none of it reached into that space, none of it interrupted what had already begun to take shape. Richard's gaze remained steady, not demanding, not overpowering, but present in a way that made it clear he was not here by accident, not here out of obligation. "I looked for you," he said finally, his voice calm, measured, but carrying something beneath it, something that spoke of the hours between the night and now, of the effort, the intention, the refusal to let that moment disappear, Amina shifted her weight slightly. The paper bag still held close against her side, her posture unchanged, grounded. But her eyes flickered for a brief second, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement of something she had not expected, not because she doubted it, but because she had not considered that the moment meant as much to him as it had simply required from her. "You did not have to," she replied, her tone even, not dismissive, not defensive, just honest, as if stating something obvious, something that did not need to be complicated. Richard let out a small breath, the faintest hint of something softer. Crossing his expression, "No," he said, "I did not," and for a second, that was all, a simple agreement that did not end the conversation, but deepened it, because what followed was not about obligation, it was about choice, the same choice that had defined everything from the beginning. He took another small step forward, not closing the distance completely, but enough to make the space between them feel more intentional, more real. "But I needed to," he added quietly, "and the difference between those two statements settled into the air with a weight that did not need explanation." Amina's eyes held his for a moment longer, searching, not for answers, but for truth, for something that felt real enough to stand on, and whatever she saw there made her exhale slowly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction, not fully, but enough to signal a shift. "Why?" she asked, the question simple, direct, but carrying more than curiosity, because it was not just about his search, it was about what came after, about what this meant beyond the moment they had shared. Richard did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because the answer was not something he could deliver quickly, not something that fit into a single sentence. His gaze drifted for a brief second, not away from her, but inward, as if he was aligning the words with something deeper. "Because you stayed when no one else did," he said finally, his voice steady, but quieter now, more reflective, "and I realized I would not have." The admission did not come with hesitation, but it carried a kind of weight that made it clear it was not something he was used to saying, not something he had said before. Amina's expression shifted slightly at that, not into surprise, but into something closer to understanding, because the truth in his words was not about comparison, it was about recognition, about seeing something in himself that he had not wanted to see before, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer empty, but full, holding the meaning of what had just been said, the honesty of it, the impact of it. "You do not know that," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, not challenging, but offering a different perspective. "People do not know what they will do until they are there." Richard looked at her, really looked this time, taking in not just her words, but the calm certainty behind them, the way she spoke without needing to prove anything, without needing to convince, and something in that steadiness resonated more than any argument could have. "Maybe," he said, and for the first time, there was a hint of uncertainty in his tone, not weakness, but openness, the kind that allowed something new to take shape. Amina shifted the bag in her hands slightly, her fingers tightening and then relaxing again, a small movement, but one that grounded her in the moment. "You are here now," she said, her voice returning to that same quiet steadiness. "That is what matters." The simplicity of it landed cleanly, without excess, without complication, and for a second, Richard let those words settle, let them exist without trying to reshape them, because for once, the solution was not something he needed to construct, it was something he needed to accept. The city continued around them, the rhythm unchanged, but in that small space on the sidewalk, something had shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that would not reverse. Because this was no longer just about a moment in the rain, it was about what that moment revealed, what it changed, and what it made possible moving forward. And as they stood there, facing each other not as strangers anymore, but as two people connected by a choice that neither of them could undo, the next step did not feel uncertain, it felt inevitable. The moment did not break, it deepened, settling into something quieter but more defined, as if the air between them had shifted from uncertainty into understanding. And for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had already been said was still unfolding, still finding its place. Amina adjusted her grip on the paper bag again, a small, grounding motion, her eyes drifting briefly to the street beside them where life continued without pause. Cars passing, people moving, voices blending into a steady rhythm that did not slow for moments like this. and yet, despite that movement, she remained still, present, choosing not to step away. Richard noticed that, the choice in it, the same quiet decision she had made the night before, and something in him recognized it now, not as something rare, but as something deliberate. Something that came from a place he had not understood before. "What were you thinking?" he asked suddenly, the question soft but direct, his gaze steady on hers, not intrusive, just curious in a way that carried weight. Amina blinked once, caught slightly off guard by the question, not because it was difficult, but because it reached back into a moment she had not tried to explain, even to herself. She let out a small breath, her eyes lowering for a second before returning to his. "Nothing," she said at first, then paused, reconsidering. "No. Not nothing," she corrected quietly, her voice thoughtful now. Searching for something that felt accurate. "I was thinking, if I leave, then he is alone." The words came out simple, unpolished, but they landed with a clarity that needed no elaboration. Richard's expression shifted, not visibly at first, but something in his posture changed, a slight stillness, a deeper focus, as if the answer had reached further than he expected. "That is all?" he asked, not dismissing it, but trying to understand how something so small could carry so much weight. Amina gave a small shrug, her shoulders rising and falling gently. "That is enough," she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no need to justify or expand, because to her, it truly was enough. The simplicity of it settled into the space between them, but instead of making it feel smaller, it made it feel larger, more significant, because it revealed something fundamental, something that did not rely on circumstance or status or recognition, just a choice. Richard looked at her for a long moment, really looked, not at the situation, not at the contrast between their worlds, but at her, the steadiness in her presence, the way she stood without needing anything from him, without expecting anything in return, and something in that realization shifted again, quietly but completely. "You did not ask for anything," he said, more to himself than to her, the observation forming as he spoke it. Amina tilted her head slightly, her brow softening just a fraction. "Why would I?" she asked, the question genuine, not rhetorical, as if the idea itself did not fully make sense to her. Richard let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, but not quite, more like the release of something he had been holding without realizing it, because most people would, he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, just acknowledgement, the reality of a world he knew well. Amina considered that for a second, her gaze drifting briefly to the side before returning. "Maybe," she said, "but that does not mean they should." The answer was calm, but firm in its own way, not challenging him, but offering a different perspective, one that did not fit into the structure he was used to, and that difference was what made it matter. The noise of the street continued around them, but it felt distant now, secondary, like something happening outside of a moment that had become more focused, more intentional. Richard shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle but deliberate, as if he was stepping into something new, something he did not fully understand yet, but was willing to follow. "Come with me," he said, the words quiet, but carrying a clear intention, not an order, not a demand, but an invitation. Amina's expression changed slightly at that, not into surprise, but into something more cautious, more thoughtful, her grip on the bag tightening just a little. "Where?" she asked, her tone steady, but measured. Richard did not answer immediately, not because he was unsure, but because the answer was not a place, not exactly. "Somewhere we can talk," he said finally, his voice calm, open, leaving space for her to decide, for her to choose, just as she had before. Amina looked at him for a moment longer, weighing something that did not need to be spoken, the difference between their worlds, the uncertainty of what this could become, and yet, beneath all of that, there was something familiar, something she recognized from the night before, the same presence, the same steadiness, and slowly, she nodded once. Not because she fully understood what came next, but because she was willing to find out. And as they stood there, the moment shifted once again, not ending, not resolving, but opening, creating a path forward that neither of them had planned, but both of them had chosen. The decision did not feel dramatic, it did not carry the weight of something irreversible, but it settled between them with a quiet certainty that neither of them tried to interrupt. And as Amina stepped forward, closing the distance that had once separated them, the world around them seemed to shift slightly, not because anything had changed, but because they were no longer standing still within it. They were moving, together, towards something neither of them had planned, the car door opened. With a soft click, and for a brief second, Amina hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness, the contrast between where she stood and what waited just beyond that door, the difference in space, in expectation, in everything that usually defined the line between two people like them, but then she stepped in anyway, her movements calm, deliberate, choosing not to let that difference decide for her. Richard followed a moment later, the door closing quietly behind them, sealing off the noise of the street and replacing it with a softer, more contained silence. The car began to move, smooth and steady, merging back into the flow of the city, and for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment itself was still unfolding, still finding its shape. Amina sat with her hands resting loosely in her lap, the paper bag placed carefully beside her, her gaze drifting briefly to the window where the city passed by in reflections and fragments, familiar but slightly altered by the angle, by the perspective. Richard watched her. For a moment, not intrusively, not analyzing, just observing the quiet steadiness she carried with her, the same steadiness that had held him together on the side of the road, and something in that recognition grounded him in a way he had not expected. "What is your name?" he asked finally, his voice calm, the question simple but carrying a kind of importance that made it feel overdue. Amina turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Amina," she said, her tone even, unguarded, as if the answer did not need to be protected. Richard nodded once, repeating it quietly, "Amina," as if committing it to something deeper than memory, something more permanent. "I am Richard," he added, not because he expected her to recognize it, but because the exchange mattered, the balance of it. Amina gave a small nod in return, acknowledging it without reaction, without the weight that name might carry elsewhere, and in that absence, something shifted again, something that made the space between them feel more equal, more grounded. The car moved through another intersection, the light changing, the rhythm of the city continuing uninterrupted, and inside, the conversation found its way forward, not rushed, not forced, but steady. "You said you stayed because you did not want me to be alone," Richard said, his voice softer now, more reflective. "Does that happen often?" The question was not casual. It carried a quiet curiosity about something beyond the moment itself. Amina considered it for a second, her eyes lowering briefly before returning to him. "More than people think," she replied, her voice calm, but carrying a depth that suggested experience rather than assumption. Richard leaned back slightly, absorbing that, the simplicity of her answer revealing something broader, something he had not seen before. "And no one else stops?" he asked, not accusing, not judgmental, just trying to understand. Amina shook her head slightly. "Sometimes they do," she said, "but not always when it matters." The words landed with a quiet weight, not heavy, not dramatic, just true, and that truth settled into the space between them, reshaping it once again. Richard looked down for a brief moment, his fingers brushing lightly against his knee, a small, thoughtful gesture. "I built my life on making decisions quickly," he said after a moment, his voice measured, reflective, seeing opportunities, moving forward, not hesitating. He paused slightly, then added, "But last night I realized something." Amina watched him quietly, not interrupting, not guiding, just present, allowing the words to come as they needed to. "I would have driven past," he said finally, the admission calm, but carrying a depth that did not need emphasis. "I would have seen it, and kept going." The car continued forward, the city unfolding outside, but inside, the moment held steady. Amina did not respond immediately, not because she disagreed, but because she understood what he was saying, without needing to fill it. "But you did not," she said instead, her voice quiet, grounding the moment in what was true now, not what might have been. Richard looked at her, something shifting in his expression again, something lighter, but also more certain. "No," he said, "I did not," and for the first time, there was something close to clarity in that statement, not just about the night before, but about what came after, about the choice he was making now. The car slowed slightly as it turned onto a quieter street, the buildings changing, the noise fading just enough to create a different kind of space, and in that space, something settled between them, not a conclusion, not an ending, but a beginning, quiet, steady, and real, because what had started as a moment of necessity had become something more, something that neither of them could have planned, but both of them had chosen to continue. And as the car came to a gentle stop, the movement easing into stillness once again, It was clear that the story had not ended on that road in the rain, it had only found its way into something new, something that would continue beyond this moment, shaped not by circumstance, but by the choices they were willing to make next.